Hi, everyone. I'm Logan Baldwin, the Executive Director of Klamath Film. With me, I have Sarah Shively, Director of the Story Project of Measure 110, Part 1, Peers. Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about your filmmaking background?
Sure. Well, I'm relatively new to documentary filmmaking. I went back to school during the pandemic and did a master's degree in multimedia journalism. But I'm not entirely new to the production part of this. When I lived in New York, I was a part owner of a small media production company. And we did a variety of things. Some of it had to do with content in the theater world, and some of it was for benefit auction events, that kind of a thing. Mostly smaller projects. And during those years, I made my first narrative short film. I had been doing some screenwriting and I had a feature length film that I was working on. And in preparation for seeking funding, we redeveloped it into a short film. And that screened initially, it premiered at Outfest in Los Angeles. It ran the film circuit, and then it ended its film run at the Marché de Cannes for the Cannes Film Festival. So that was my first introduction to filmmaking. And then more recently, as a consequence of my education, I have gotten into doing documentary filmmaking, especially with a journalistic lens.
Right. So, what inspired you to create the story project of Measure 110 Peers? How did you first become involved with Measure 110 and the peer support workforce in Oregon?
So during my program, I did a project that was in 2022. It was an explainer video, and it was a short update to Measure 110 and where things were at that time. And that was really just something that I was interested in large part because I had already worked with Morgan Godvin, who's one of the people you hear from in Measure 110. Morgan's an expert in this space and is a person with lived experience. And she and I had known one another for a while. She had worked with me on another project that was at the Klamath Independent Film Festival last year on mugshots. So it was because of that relationship and because of that initial project that this was already a topic, an issue that was on my radar. And there was a lot coming out in the media around this, but I felt like no one was really giving the talking stick to the people who needed to have it the most and who deserved to have it the most. And I became more interested in doing a little more of a deep dive and talking to what I felt were the right people. And Morgan was entirely behind that process. And so that's sort of where it came from. We wrapped production on part 2, but we're just beginning the edit on that. So the second part really focuses on that decriminalization and now recriminalization part of it. But to start with, because the funding was rolling out rather slowly, the very first thing that they were really able to bolster was the peer force. And they were able to hire more people, pay people a living wage. It made a huge difference in the harm reduction space. So that was really something we could report about. So that's where we started.
Right, I see. Um, Peer support specialists are at the heart of the film. How did you approach telling their stories and highlighting the importance of lived experience in the recovery process?
Well, Candy Balaban, who's one of the people we interview, I got connected to her through Morgan. I really, asked Morgan to recommend someone she felt whose personal story was very poignant, who was a leader in the peer space, and she suggested that I get connected with Candy. Morgan facilitated that initially. Was able to take the time to go and spend a day with Candy in advance of any shooting, any interview. And I just felt that she was really a very compelling person and someone that we needed to hear from. And she also spoke to the circumstances that are facing people in rural Oregon. She's in Columbia County. They lack a lot of resources. They don't even have a hospital. So there are a lot of needs for people who are facing drug addiction in Columbia County, people who are homeless in Columbia County. And Candy is really on the front line of what the concerns are, and what needs to be done and what more needs to be done. She's very aware. So that was how that relationship started. I then wanted to contrast Candy with a more urban story, and ideally a story of a person of color. And I reached out initially to the folks at Bridges to Change, and they recommended that I contact Julia Mines, who's the executive director at America's Club. And Julia, when I told her that I was really interested in meeting with one of her leading peers, she recommended Will, and he's just this very vivacious, wonderful, extraordinary guy. And Will was really fun to work with because to really get the heart of who Will is and what he does, we needed to see him in action. And that was sort of like one thing led to another. Working with him was what brought in then Daniel and John Lee, who are recovery clients. And they were incredibly open to letting us follow them around and share their stories. And I hadn't initially really planned to focus on people who were in recovery, but that was really the way we were able to see Will doing the work of a peer.
Totally. So what were some of the most important lessons you learned from the peer support specialists and the individuals in recovery while working on this film? How did their experiences shape your approach to storytelling?
Well, first of all, I think what I discovered was that initially this wasn't called the Story Project. But I found as I started interviewing people and listening to people, regardless of where they were in relation to their recovery, that they all had a story and they needed to tell their story. And I started to realize that for those of us who maybe live outside of this space but have been reading the news and are really, confounded by the crisis that Oregon is facing when it comes to drug addiction and homelessness and mental health and what we're seeing on the streets. What was kind of missing was the humanity. And you can't get that unless you start talking to people and listening to people and hearing what their life stories are. And there were certainly themes that were running through these storylines. I mean, the vast majority of people who have faced drug addiction have some trauma in their lives. Everything from abuse and childhood poverty. Their circumstances sometimes are generational. There's all manner of issues, and those sort of speak to deeper societal concerns. But the really wonderful thing about peers and the mentors in this space is that they are the hope. They live it every day. And people who are deep in their addiction or just beginning recovery, they need to see that. They need to touch base and be in face to face with people who have actually been in their shoes. It's not enough to be with a doctor or a psychologist or somebody who, or law enforcement or the judge. These, people who surround them and their addiction know an awful lot, but they don't necessarily know what it is to walk in their shoes. And peers do.
Right, absolutely. So, having said that, what do you hope audiences will take away from watching Peers? What kind of impact do you want this documentary to have on public perceptions of drug addiction and recovery?
Well, largely, I want people to understand that these people are neighbors, and these people are our friends, and they aren't somehow other. They're our family members. They are part of who we are as a society, and we all have a responsibility to help one another, especially when we have some very, very vulnerable people in Oregon right now, and it's very convenient to look the other way. But we can't. We can't. And it's harder to look the other way when you know what someone's name is, and you know a little bit about their background, and you know what they've been going through. It's harder to just say, well, they must be from somewhere else, or that they aren't one of us, or somehow they're different, because they're not. And um, so I feel like that's mostly what I want people to walk away with, is a sense of, this could be me. This could be someone I know and love. It is not just this data driven problem. These are individual human lives we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a sense of community open up a little bit, I get it. So you mentioned earlier that you wrapped up already production on part two. I wanted to ask you about how you see the future of the movement and its impact on the addiction and recovery in Oregon and beyond. Specifically, talking about the 2024 recriminalization, that word, of
Yeah.
small drug possession. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we're right now, as we speak, just 1 week into the recriminalization. And so the impact of that, remains to be seen, right? House Bill 4002 that passed at the very end of February did a number of things, and it wasn't a wholesale bad House bill, but the fact that it recriminalized was a huge blow to the people in the recovery space. Because Measure 110 was built on a fundamental philosophy to stop harming people who are experiencing addiction. Okay? Criminalizing people for their addiction is harmful. Incarcerating people is harmful, and incarcerating people because they are addicted to an illicit drug is harmful. So that was sort of the underpinning behind the whole movement. By the time we get to 4002 and the decision to recriminalize, we've been through, a whole difficult episode that was a series of cascading problems between the pandemic, the introduction of fentanyl into the, drug supply chain on the West Coast, housing costs, astronomical housing costs. And then we didn't really have the support of law enforcement, especially in Portland, behind decriminalization. It was sort of sabotaged. So there is some good things with House Bill 4002. There wasn't a real shift in the tone in which policymakers and lawmakers were taking when it came to talking about addiction. There seemed to be an increased appreciation that this is a medical condition, this is a disorder, and something that we need to look at through a different lens than jail time. So that's good. There also was a lot of money being infused for housing for sobering centers, for detox centers. And Measure 110 included funding for that as well, but that's just scratching the surface. You can't do one round of funding and expect that we're going to correct this entire problem. Oregon is critically underfunded when it comes to drug recovery services. There's virtually in all of Multnomah County, if you want to go into detox, there's 90 beds, and that with Measure 110 funding, they propped up over 20% of that. That's just not nearly enough. We need a lot more. So there is more money coming in for some of those resources. So those things are good. But the recriminalization part, they're trying some. Well, first of all, decriminalization was novel, right? And so now with recriminalization, they're also trying some novel things as far as their efforts to deflect a lot of it from people within the recovery world. They're very dubious about whether or not these systems will work. Part of it is that they push the whole situation into the legal system. And, we don't have enough public defenders as it is. Where are we going to suddenly get more to untangle the crisis that we're in? It's going to be messy. I'll tell you that much. Whether it will work, the data will tell us. It's not very. I don't think it has very much to offer for people who are not legal citizens. If you're not a citizen and you're caught with any amount of drugs on you, that can really blow a hole in your, whole process towards citizenship. So that's an issue.
Certainly. Well, I have my final question here. You mentioned plans to expand the story project into other mediums such as audio storytelling, music, and art. How do you see these additional formats contributing to the larger narrative of Measure 110 and the lives it affects?
Yeah, so far we haven't really ventured down that path yet.
Right.
Yeah, but the idea is that the way people tell stories can be quite different from person to person. So one person can sit down and tell you their narrative, but another person is going to put it in song, and another person is going to draw it out for you. And I think that there's all kinds of media out there that can give people the space and permission to share their experiences. So what we were hoping with some of this, if we're able to expand the project to include more than just documentary filmmaking, that we might be able to container some of these other kinds of expressions of story.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think I don't know if you were thinking like podcasts, but that's massive nowadays. Podcasts. I think you would get a lot of ears on the issue. If that were one way of doing it. Well, thank you, Sarah, for sitting with me and talking with me about it. Do you have any final words before we sign off?
Well, Logan, I really wish I could be with you there at the festival. It's going to be wonderful. I was there last year, really, really enjoyed it. I know you're working really hard. It's a huge undertaking to put on any festival, and especially one like this. You didn't just walk into some small, festival with no legacy. You picked up a pretty heavy project here. So I wish you the best of luck, and I'm looking forward to being able to see some of the other films via the online portion.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for submitting your film to the Klamath Independent Film Festival. The story project of Measure 110, Part 1 Piers will be available on Eventive for a limited time as part of our online showcase. Fantastic.
Thank you.